Okay, hello chess players. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to solve one of the biggest adult improver traps that I run into. And it's something that prevents adults from improving. And it's, I guess, kind of like a psychological kind of head game on how they should work at their chess. Anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So one of the biggest questions that I get with adult improvers is, should I be studying the opening at all? Or how much of the opening should I study? And always oftentimes it's modified with at my level, how much of the opening should I be studying? So let me give you an example of somebody that I thought was studying the opening too much, or at the very least studying the opening in the wrong way. I knew an adult that was trying to get better, and he would study the opening a lot. The problem was is he only studied the one opening. He would spend most of his time studying the King's Indian defense, and he spent an enormous amount of time looking at a very specific line within the King's Indian. He was looking at e5 and then d5 and then knight h5, and then after queen d2 he was looking at queen h4 check. This is called the Bronstein variation of the King's Indian. It involves a queen sacrifice. So, of course, this was appealing to study because it's a highly entertaining way to play chess. The position continues g3, knight takes g3, queen f2, knight takes f1, queen takes h4, knight to e3. And he actually spent a lot of time going into a relative sideline. The main line here is supposed to be king e2, and then the main line is actually to take this pawn on c4. He was looking at this alternative continuation beginning with knight g2, queen f2, knight f4, and then following up with f5, which is of course perfectly a perfectly reasonable way to play chess. Uh, what's interesting is he spent an enormous amount of time looking at this sort of very specific position, and he didn't really spend a lot of time looking at anything else. So obviously, if this specific position doesn't come up in his game, he's going to be completely lost on what to do. And there are so many alternatives before you get to that position. It's almost laughable. Like on queen h4 check, you could have simply bishop f2, queen e7, and castle's queenside is one way to play chess. So they can kind of evacuate last minute. And of course, they can evacuate from this strategy even earlier. They can simply play knight on g to e2, and you're never going to get anything close to the Bronstein variation. You're never going to even get a whiff of a queen sacrifice in this position. You're not going to get anywhere near it. The knight on g to e2 firmly covers the g3 square, so now the idea of knight h5 followed by queen h4 check is just firmly refuted now by simply playing g3 at the end of that. So now you have to play some different strategy in this position, and you have to be familiar with it. So in my experience, a lot of opening study typically isn't bad if you study a wide range of openings. The other question that I get all the time is how much of the opening, should I be studying at my level? Shouldn't I just focus on, middle games and end games? And that's such a difficult question to answer because, of course, number one, depending on your level, okay, what level are you? Let's start with that. There's a big difference between somebody rated 800, where I would say the majority of your opening preparation should just be don't fall for the four move checkmate, and somebody rated 1600, where maybe your opening preparation should go quite a bit deeper. You should at least know enough of the opening to where you're not losing the game in 7 or 8 moves and you're not losing to some sort of trap. Another issue becomes once you start getting to the point where you do want to do that deeper endgame study, I don't know how to cover the endgame without covering the opening that it came from. So, just an example, like let's say we have, Roy Lopez, fairly quickly into the Berlin variation, we're going to exchange queens and we're going to end up here. And okay, and we want to spend a lot of time studying this particular endgame. Great. We need to know how we got here. So I can't really study this endgame with somebody without studying the opening. So when you start getting away from just the purely theoretical endgames, like the Lucena position, the Philidor draw, king and pawn versus king, basic theoretical endgames where we get down to a handful of pieces. Once you start getting into studying practical endgames and practical middle games, and to be fair, this isn't even an endgame yet. The Berlin endgame itself is more like a queenless middle game for a while, and then after a few pieces get exchanged, then we're going to be in an endgame. So how do we study the middle game and how do we study the end game without studying the opening it came from? And I have so many examples of that. Another example would be the Carol Khan, especially in the classical variation. There are endgame implications that happen fairly quickly just already right here. There's a kingside bind. What happens when the knight goes to e5 and we make this exchange? What happens when we enter that endgame down the road, like if queens get exchanged, for example? And what are the implications of that? How do we play that endgame? How do I cover that endgame without covering how we got there? So at a certain point, there's going to be a lot of crossover between the opening, the middle game, and the end game, and there isn't really a separation. The best and the biggest piece of advice that I give to people when concerned about what they should be studying, and whenever I tell them this, it always just it sound whenever I say it for whatever reason, it's just something that's never occurred to them. I tell people to study complete games. And if you ask any strong player how they got good at chess, they of course studied complete games of chess. They studied My Six Memorable Games by Bobby Fischer. They studied Zurich 1953 by David Bronstein. That's the majority of what we do when we play chess is we study complete games. And even when I do my opening preparation, I usually will cite the complete game that comes from my prepared line, and then I'll go through and I'll computer check that line, and then I'll try to come up with improvements. But it's almost always attached to a complete game, which gives me an idea on how not just to play the opening, but also gives me clues on how to play the middle game and how to play the end game. And actually, when Fischer quit playing chess, this was one of his big complaints, was that the availability of that information to younger players and the availability of it in the form of, back then it was informants and etc., was so prevalent that it was making it very difficult to get an advantage against people anymore by just knowing how to play chess better, because they were getting enough clues on how to play the middle game and how to play the end game by simply looking at these complete games that had been published. And now they had a really good idea on how to play the middle game and end game without necessarily having a firm grasp on all of the concepts involved in all of these decisions, just by seeing these decisions get made over and over again in all of these complete games. So that's really how you get out of that thinking trap, is you just start studying complete games, stop worrying about how much of the opening is in that game and how much of the middle game is in that game and how much of it is the end game. And furthermore, it's really difficult to define. Like for me, I don't know what is the opening. When does it end? So for some people, opening preparation might end on move 30. For other people, opening preparation might end on move 7, and that might be the exact same opening. So like where does the opening end? Where does the end game start? Where does the middle game end? And where does the middle game transition into the end game? At a certain point, these distinctions and these lines, they get really, really fuzzy, and the better you get, there's really just no distinction at all. It's just a chess game. So anyways, that's my advice. Just study complete games and stop worrying about how much of each part of the game you're supposed to be studying, because if you worry too much about it, you end up not studying anything at all. And of course, that's a lot worse. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful, useful, and I hope you learned something new about chess by watching this video, and I hope this helps you study more efficiently. Thank you very much for watching.